says Restream is broadcasting now. I'm just waiting for it to hit YouTube, and there it goes. We are live. Imagine that. 10 months and a week later, Steve and I are back. And so, it's been a nice break from it all. Just watching all the stupid going on. Steve and I are going to do our best to keep things PC because they've been looking for any reason to censor and shut down anybody about anything. So we figured, Dead Sea Scrolls is a good enough topic. Everybody can watch the media and what's come out today about the goings on over the last year and a half. And it's all you can do is say, told you so, because what did they do? They called us conspiracy theorists and other name-calling nonsense for a year and 9 months. So now it's all starting to come full circle. But here we are. We're back. Welcome, Steve.
Welcome yourself. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
We've been talking in between and discussing stuff, but nothing on the air, really.
Yeah, well, you and I speak almost every week, probably, or more.
Yeah, if not more.
So, yeah. But we've kept all of these people out in the world in the dark for the last nearly year.
So we got to remember where we left off.
Yep. And let's see. I wonder if it showed up on Facebook. It doesn't look like my broadcast is streaming to Facebook, though. Nope, of course not. Huh. Well, that's an issue. I wonder what happened there. I'll have to figure something out later, but it's supposed to be streaming over there. I haven't even logged into Twitter in a year. I hate Twitter. So, Steve, what all have you discovered in the last year? More you than me. I've kind of just followed what you were working on.
Well, we probably should pick up where the last thing we were talking about was the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the basis of the book I wrote was not precisely about the scrolls, but all the intrigue that led up to them and how there was a lot of dubious kind of claims going on. The most significant claim was that Jules Isaac wrote a book called Jesus and Israel, which was really the backbone of what ended up in Vatican II. But a lot of this stuff has disappeared. You can't find it. You go into the Google documents, for instance, for such a weighty text, there's no references to it at all. You can't download it. You can't see it or anywhere. So the interesting thing about that was Jesus and Israel was really written before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the writer, Jules Isaac, actually refers to possibly finding the Dead Sea Scrolls before anybody knew about them.
Yeah.
That intrigued me, and that prodded me to write the book. But that I kind of left the book. When you write books like this, one of the things you're trying to do is beat everybody else to the punch because you don't know who's thinking about what. So there's a lot of things that were left untied up, which I've been looking at for the last year.
And you had come across documents that essentially, so the CIA was founded on June 26th, 1947, and then on 3 days later, on June 29th, 1947, they held a conference in Seelisberg, Switzerland. What was that about?
Well, we didn't know that was the fact at the time. What we knew at the time of my writing the book was that all the key players to Vatican II, what I should lead up to Vatican II, but to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was preliminary meetings before all this went down, which was always kind of a suspicious thing. Why? What are they discussing? Why are they doing it? And so there's a conference called the Seelisberg Conference, and in Switzerland. As much as I wanted to research the book, I could not find much reference at all to this conference. And even though I went ahead and published the book, I was still not It didn't sit well with me that I couldn't find more on Seelisberg. So in the past year, I've been looking and looking and looking for a reference. What I did find one day, I actually found the program. Now, I don't know if I can hold this up if people can see that or not.
Yeah, they should be able to see that.
All right. This was the actual program that was handed out or documented the whole thing. And it goes into the theology. It goes into that they're going to try to create, the Catholic Church and the Jews are trying to create a commission whereby they can get past the Holocaust and solve the problems between Catholicism and Judaism. But when I opened up the first page, it gives a table of contents. And again, I don't know if that's visible or not.
Not too much.
Okay. So on the bottom of the table, it's basically the second page of the document. It has a sponsorship stamp by a group called the Fraternity Mondiale. And underneath it, it has, in parentheses, World Brotherhood. Now you go through this and you try to say, well, what was that? There was if you look at the attendance, there's like normal people, but there's always kind of oddball people that you wonder why, what would they have to do with? Some had Marxist connections, some were just Catholic priests, some were, Jewish rabbis and things like that. But there were people that had, they didn't really have a notoriety in that type of thing. So what I instantly tried to do is I tried to look up, well, what's the World Brotherhood? And I came across this document as part of a FOIA request. And what it says is it's basically written to Alan Dulles of the CIA by Everett R. Glinchy, who actually ended up being one of the attendants at the Seelisberg conference.
And I'm going to show that from the database up on screen here.
Okay.
And, for those who don't know, if you go to the database on the Logos Media website, the brain link is up at the top of the website. But if you just type in Seelisberg or Seelisberg Conference, these will come up, and you can find these documents up here on the database. So here's the first one that Steve was just showing, and you can go through it. And here's the table of contents, so people can see that now. And right now we're talking about Everett R. Glinchy.
Right. Who was, in all fairness, he was working on some sort of amicable solution even before the war between the Jews and the Christians and stuff like that. But obviously going into all this, he had CIA connections. And so the question is, now that you can kind of show that these are fabricated, it's hard to call them whether they're a hoax or what they are, because what's happening here is, as we've talked about, I think most of the Dead Sea Scrolls have some basis and authenticity. It's how are they dated and what era are they from, and were they mixed with other papers trying to prove something else? One of the people that was part of this Seelisberg conference had connections, was a brother or a son-in-law, I believe, of Moses Gaster. So when you go into all this, all the original Jewish scholars, the main ones, Solomon Zeitlin, said these papers, the Dead Sea Scrolls have this odd feeling like they're from a thing called it's a group of papers in Egypt where it is a collection that ended up in the John Reisland library.
And you're talking about the Cairo Geniza scroll?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. And what happened is that the person that was actually representing the Jews at the conference was a son-in-law of Moses Gaster. And so everybody was trying to figure out, everything I've read is, what is the connection? How would the Dead Sea Scrolls end up with documents from the Cairo Geniza? The thing is that Moses Gaster owned them all at that point in time. He had them stashed in London during World War II. The they were accidentally bombed by the Germans, and there was a huge fire. Most of them weren't destroyed, but Moses Gaster had actually hired scribes to duplicate some of these documents. So now you have an oddball connection between the CIA and a connection to somebody who could have easily, fabricated some of these documents. So now, when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, I've just been, when we decided we were going to do this broadcast, I started looking into some of this again to refresh my memory. The main document that we're talking about, the entire Dead Sea Scrolls are presented as if they had somehow invalidated Christian history. In that what they were trying to prove, Jules Isaac was trying to prove from the beginning, is that Christianity was not an Orthodox religion to begin with. It was a Gnostic religion to begin with. That's what he had predicted. Several other writers had predicted similar type things. But the only thing, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, that actually predicts such a thing is called the War Scroll. The War Scroll talks about a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. Now, and if you read it, it's just a war thing. It's a war, just to read the first sentence. For the instructor, the rule of the war, the first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness, the army of Belial, the troops of Edom, Moab, and the sons of Ammon, the Amalekites. And it goes on, and it's just war strategies and war things like that. That was presented as if it was a Gnostic thing because it was dualistic. It had light and dark and that kind of thing.
Right.
The problem, and I know you've been into the Gnostic things yourself, it doesn't read to me like a Gnostic text at all. I don't know if I should go into reading another Gnostic text, but the one that probably is most Gnostic is the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yeah.
And if you read into it, the Corpus Hermeticum is actually a perversion of the beginning of John's gospel. So when you hear about darkness and light, it has all these things have kind of a mystical quality to it that are leading to this concept of the one mind, or the one emerged, that somehow some mind meld with God or something like that. They're not war documents at all. So I don't know if many people probably don't research things like this, but as you go through history, you can kind of look at different other frauds through history. And usually there's something anachronistic about them, some detail out of place, some detail out of time. People know now that the flat Earth thing was kind of a hoax of the 1800s. Nobody believed the Earth was flat, and that was actually pushed in the 1800s. But there's other things that go back. For example, there was the donation of Constantine. It was considered a document whereby the emperor of the Byzantine emperor Constantine divided the world up into the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Well, I think it was about 1343 or so, Lorenzo Valla declared that the document itself, that all these political divisions were based on, was a fraud. And what he did is he found a word within the text that wasn't from that time period, that the document wasn't written. So you start looking at things like that. Another one was Pseudo Dionysius, Lorenzo Valla also said was a fraud. The Catholic Church didn't accept it a fraud until the 1800s, but again, they found evidence of something that was out of place, a word or two that didn't fit the time period the thing was written in. And you can go on, you can find all these things like that. But when you start looking at the War Scroll, it doesn't read like a Gnostic text at all. It reads like something that was a product of the late 1800s, early 1900s idea of what Gnosticism ought to be, not what it actually was.
Right.
Okay. Now, a lot of scholarship has been done since then. And this may be relevant to today, wink, wink, nod, nod, is that research has been done on the kind of the premier Gnostics were the Manichaeans and the Cathars. So when you read about we as Christians and philosophers and things, we look at them and we always see these dualistic principles. And so we kind of project onto them that that's what they were really about. And if you look at the modern research on what the Manichaeans were, a lot of what we project onto them nowadays is really a product of the 1800s. If you go back, for instance, a good example was everybody thought the Egyptian hieroglyphs had to do with mystical qualities and mystical magic done by the Egyptians and things like that, until Napoleon went down and sent people down to research them. One was Champollion, and they redeciphered that. That was really what the Rosetta Stone proved, is that they were able to retranslate them and found out that most of this mysticism was a product of the 17 and 1800s. It had nothing to do with what the actual hieroglyphs stood for. And I think what you've got going on here is a similar thing, where if you actually do the research, read the research on the Manichaeans, what really motivated them was a kind of obsessive compulsive disorder. What they were really fueling them is that they would take things like thou shalt not kill and take them to their extreme, whereby you live your life in the expectation that if you to kill anything, it's a sin. Well, that didn't just apply to people or animals. It applied to microorganisms or whatever ants or anything that was going on at the time. And it turned out the only way you could live that life was to declare yourself an elite, which they called a perfect or a prefect. And then what you did is you hired underlings.
Like the perfectibilists.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and a lot to do with, it was literally an elite class in society, which you hired what you might call slaves to go around and do your dirty bits for you. So that's the real Manichaeans. Now, we as theologians and philosophers would look back at that and say, well, that's dualistic. It's paradoxical. You can't do it. But their philosophy really rose out of this idea that you could find a life that if God was God, he would have produced something perfect like that. And so the only perfection they could find is doing away with reality altogether.
Right. Exactly. And I think that thou shalt not kill was really mistranslated when it should have been thou shalt not murder.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But so what you see is this obsession with trying to solve a problem that can't be solved.
Right.
That's the thing that motivated them. So now you look at some of these documents, and I maybe be the only one, maybe I'm not a scholar enough to know, but it seems to me that the War Scroll is not a Gnostic text. Or if it is a Gnostic text, it was something that was either fabricated to look like a Gnostic text of what they thought Gnosticism was over that time period, or it was something taken from another document. And if you look at that, that's precisely what it is. You can download different pieces and bits of the War Scrolls. It's a document all by itself. Most of the things are bits and pieces. The War Scroll, where this is from, is actually an almost complete document, which makes you a little bit suspicious there.
What is well, there's a rabbit hole there. But before we hit on Fomenko,
I got a thing to lead to that, so let's wrap this one up, okay?
All right, but what is the strongest? And basically, before you started looking into this, you were a little bit skeptical about my work on MK Ultra or whatever, and then once you had found all these connections between Seelisberg and the CIA.
Yeah, you made a believer out of me.
Yeah, it made everything connect. And then, you realize the psychedelic revolution and the 60s counterculture, all of that is MK Ultra.
Well, let me add
let me just say, though, but the first, as far as we can tell, so 3 days after the CIA is founded, they have this conference in Seelisberg, and their first act is apparently to fake the Dead Sea Scrolls with this group, the World Brotherhood, and the Lasky people and these others, so that I showed on screen in the database a bit ago. But this attack, and and we'll go into this more, but it leads to Vatican II. It leads to all of this other stuff, and it leads to this crumbling of Christianity and this decay of society. Well, what did MK Ultra do but the exact same thing years later? So, we start to see this multi-pronged attack that they're using from all of these different directions.
Yeah, and the thing is, it doesn't just end there either, because I had thought I had found something in Jules Isaac's writing that was unique, in that he was trying to show that there was evidence before it was out of order. If you believe his datings of his manuscripts and stuff, he's discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls before they're discovered. Well, there's something oddball going on. Modernism was trying to take over the Catholic Church at the time, and that goes back to the mid 1800s. Unfortunately, in the Catholic Church, you've got two Father Lagranges, and Catholics are constantly mixing these two people up. One Father Lagrange is a scholastic. He's a devotee to what we would call Logos theology or philosophy. The other one is an out-and-out heretic, and he's proclaimed a heretic. He actually sets up base in the École Biblique in Jerusalem, which is ultimately the discoverer, so-called, the repository of ultimately of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But not only is he using that as a place to so-called find evidence that his modernism was right, but he is also publishing things out of there that are questionable, and the Catholic Church is, they're not happy with this at all. But by the time you get to the 1930s, there's a Cardinal Bay rising up through the Catholic Church. He's actually taking over the papal duties during World War II, because the Pope, I believe it's Pius XII, is actually more, you've got World War II going on. But what Bay does in the persona of Pius XII, he writes a papal encyclical. And the purpose of the papal encyclical is to rehabilitate Father Lagrange's what was once heretical theology and present it as scientific. So what surprised me is I thought, well, maybe Jules Isaac was alone in predicting the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, there's a document that was written by during or right before World War II. It's a papal encyclical, Afflante Spiritus, where they also reference that because of the work of Lagrange, is that they will, or Legrand, as you would say, they're actually it's proclaimed in the papal encyclical that they're going to find evidence that the École Biblique is going to find evidence of that Christianity needs to be rewritten or redone. And what better way of overturning Christianity than falsify a bunch of archaeological evidence?
Well, and then we even saw, 4 months ago, the discovery of more new Dead Sea Scrolls that are going to rewrite history again. It's like, it's really the only thing that they deal with, that when they discover something or dig up what they planted, it's going to rewrite everything when, it's basically not like that with any other field. You don't you find something, you've got to rewrite everything. Rewrite Christianity.
Well, they're predicting where it's going to go before they release it. I mean,
right. I'm going to, my cat is, I got to let him in or he's going to freak out. So keep talking and I'll be right back in about 10 seconds.
All right. Well, that wasn't shocking enough to me. It is that I then started going through a thing that was referenced in my book, was a book called When It Was Dark, written by Guy Thorne. And when I wrote the book, I really had never heard of the book When It Was Dark until after I was almost complete with it, and the book, and I had to rewrite the book to make allowance for this book. And it always bothered me that When It Was Dark, almost to all the details, predicted archaeological evidence that would be found in Jerusalem that would overturn Christianity. It was striking. It was almost, and so I at the time I wrote the book, I thought, well, it's just an oddball book. It's interesting that somebody had the same theory, and the synchronicity of it all was kind of frightening. But when I was done with it, I thought this has got to be more than a coincidence. So I started researching when it was dark, and I found a treasure trove of oddball circumstances. Number one, When It Was Dark was not an oddball book at all. It was actually the first book that could be called a bestseller. It had They had published hundreds of thousands of copies of these things and disseminated throughout the world, basically predicting that somebody is going to find fraudulent archaeological evidence, and it would collapse Christianity until somebody proved that the evidence had been faked. So I started researching Guy Thorne, and a more oddball person you're never going to find anywhere. Guy Thorne is not his real name. It's his real name. I got another book here. I can maybe show you a picture of him. His real name is C. Ranger Gull.
Or Cyril, yeah.
Yeah. And Cyril Ranger Gull is actually a big time pornographic author. And he's a member of this group. It's the not the Despicables, but yeah, they're basically a bunch of degenerates who are into oddball sex stories. There's a lot of homoeroticism going on in these stories, and one of the loose connectors to all this was Oscar Wilde.
Right.
They call themselves the Degenerates. Let's put it that. That's the real name.
And Dorian Gray type stuff. And
yeah.
And let's just give a little. Let's go to Oscar Wilde here for a second, because we've covered him on the show before. And so Oscar Wilde, he writes Picture of Dorian Gray, and he's a member of the British Hellfire Club. And then on this side of the pond, Benjamin Franklin's brother, James Franklin, founds the American Hellfire Club. So there's, this same stuff is going on from the 1700s into more modern times with these same kind of people and the same kind of stuff. So Guy Thorne or Cyril Ranger Gull is right in the mix of all of that.
Yeah, and they're all working for this publishing house called Leonard Smithers, which they're originally dealing with all this kind of degenerate kind of literature. They have other stuff. They're kind of what would you call the same kind of basic cheap novels that people pick up in grocery stores and things,
right.
That kind of thing. But around the time Cyril Ranger Gull writes When It Was Dark, he clearly has an epiphany of some sort. And what he does is all of a sudden he changes direction. He changes his name to Guy Thorne. And eventually, within years, he turns Catholic. And if you look up Leonard Smithers, it turns out Leonard Smithers pretty much had to go out of business because a lot of these people had turned Catholic all of a sudden.
And what was your discovery or your thinking behind why they suddenly became Catholics?
That at some point, Cyril Ranger Gull had to have some sort of epiphany. The question is, where would he have gotten it from? And it took a lot of me trying to figure out and make connections on all this stuff. But right before he writes this, there's a guy who's a commandant in the French military, and he's at the center of this thing called the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was probably the most controversial thing to happen in all of the 1800s, in that what it was a Jewish military officer was accused of espionage, and it came to he was actually spent I believe it was 5 years on Devil's Island and in solitude and all this other kind of stuff. And it was this tremendous, the Jews considered the basis of this was anti-Semitism. But at the end of the trial, I think he had two trials. At towards the end, it turns out that they declared that Dreyfus was actually innocent, and they found a guy who was actually a French military officer named Commandant Esterhazy as being the real culprit behind falsifying this evidence. So what's really oddball about all this is the degenerates, Oscar Wilde and all these people go to France and smuggle Esterhazy out and take him to Guy Thorne's house where he stays for months. And he's as he's leaving France, and while he's being smuggled out, he declares he's got the greatest story of all time. That he's got basically all these people in a bad place, and eventually he's going to reveal this story that's going to change the world. He goes then to Cyril Ranger Gull's house. Cyril Ranger Gull changes his name to Guy Thorne, and he writes When It Was Dark.
And his best friend had been murdered, correct?
Yeah. Again, this is from about a year ago, so I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details on this. But it was the reason why is that right before Esterhazy gets exported out of France, his best friend is murdered, and so it's basically done. It's the conjecture is it was done to silence Esterhazy, that if he ever spilled the beans, he would be murdered.
Now, what evidence was there in When It Was Dark that coincides with what we're discussing here? Did you find anything there?
The oddest thing is actually the frontispiece is that this is written 1902, 1903, somewhere in there. There's actually a picture of a monument that was supposedly the proof that Christ had never existed, that it was a tombstone monument. And the thing was, in 1902, 1903, they weren't really up to snuff, and they didn't have the digital photography and things like this. Somewhere it looks like a very authentic piece of monument. So the question is, did they falsify this monument, or is this an actual picture of something that actually somebody had fabricated?
You mean, did they falsify the monument or the photo, or?
Yeah. I have no idea, but clearly something's going on. When you start looking into the Dreyfus affair, almost to a man, if you're Catholic, you believe it's part of a grand conspiracy, that you're pretty sure it's the Freemasons in conjunction with some fallen away Jews or something like that. The interesting connection to all this is that all the people that went to the defense of Dreyfus were people that had artistic and archaeological connections. It was a family, the Jewish family called the Reinachs, who actually had connections. They were the ones going around through France declaring whether something was a bona fide artifact or whether something wasn't a bona fide artifact.
And this is the same family that initially tried to fund the Panama Canal.
Yeah. What happened is that France had built the Suez Canal, but believing that they could fund the Panama Canal, that they had the prowess to build that, they sucked up all the money out of the French treasury to build this thing, and it was a fiasco. It was the United States that finally came in and solved it. But the Catholics in general, they put huge tax burdens on the average people in France. So what happened is the Catholics believed that they were purposely milking the Catholics dry, because all the people carrying the bonds were parts of the Reinach family, and
right,
that type of thing.
Right. All right. So where do we go from here? How does it lead up? So all of this ties into this. Well, it goes essentially. The Seelisberg Conference is shortly after World War II, and they're trying to, and basically Christians, and as we exposed a couple years ago on the show, the Baron von Bottendorf was a Muslim. He founded the Thule Society. The Thule Society founded the National Socialist German Workers' Party, a major leftist organization, and then that commits this massive genocide again, across Europe and against Jews. But the Christians actually got the blame for that. So then we see the Seelisberg conference. They're going to rectify things so that it never happens again, and basically blame the Christians.
Well, let me make a speculation. And this is, like I said, I'm kind of in the middle trying to tie things together, and I haven't quite made it yet. But my speculation is part of it is why this was such a testy affair in France. Is most people don't realize, but before the 1800s, the Catholic Church was actually owned Italy. And most of it was that they owned was called the Papal States. What there was is during the 1800s was this big purging of the monarchies of Europe. And the Catholic or connected ones and replacing them with other governments.
Right.
So Italy installed its own emperor and basically took all the Papal States away from the Catholic Church, which they didn't even recover from until just before World War II, where Mussolini actually gave them back Vatican City. But all this was being shut down. During that period, a lot of the popes would actually either have to seclude themselves in the Vatican, so out of their threat of arrest, or they would flee to other countries and set up, shop on the run. The thing that makes this all interesting, why I'm speculating France was such a contentious thing, is that what most people don't realize is that there was an auxiliary Vatican City
in France,
called the Palace of Avignon, France. And my speculation was, being that there was the French military was actually on the Catholic side and trying to reclaim France, that Avignon, France would have been a perfect place for the Pope to flee to and set up shop, just taking it entirely out of Italy.
Most people don't even realize that the Pope and the Vatican were under threat, and that the Pope couldn't even leave the Vatican.
Yeah. Well, and then Avignon was basically a largely Jewish city. So even though the Catholic Church didn't like the situation at the time, I think they full well had to know that were they going to go back to Avignon, they couldn't do it by dumping on all the Jews. They would have needed some sort of blessing by the Jews. So I think would have actually been protagonist's advantage to spark a controversy between the Catholic Church and the Jews, to topple the whole designs of moving the Palace of Vatican City to the Palace in Avignon.
All right, so let's lead up to Vatican II.
Can I go one other direction first?
Sure.
Because we were talking about Fomenko.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
So I want to recapture that. The oddball of this is if I'm right, and I almost think I have to be to some extent, then When It Was Dark has to reveal some secret facts to it, whether purposely or accidentally. The most curious one of them all was the bad guy in When It Was Dark was named Konstantin Schaub, who was portrayed as a Jewish financier. In archaeological, he had connections all over the place, was wealthy. He had connections to people. And so what he had done is he had hired somebody to fake a tomb and then present it as authentic. So I started looking at the name Schaub thinking, well, that maybe would a key to some sort of 1800s fraud. And that pretty much led nowhere. There was no connection to the name Schaub and Reinach or anything like that. So then I started looking at the name Constantine. And it's very odd that Guy Thorne would use the name Constantine because it's not really a Jewish name at all. It's a Greek name. What I did find is that there's a huge controversy that is brought up in the original, some of the beginning chapters of Fomenko's book on, as we all know, Fomenko is saying a lot of history has been falsified.
Right.
And so one of the main first things Fomenko talks about. And you're much more familiar with him than I am, and we've talked about that quite a lot.
Well, at one point he had agreed to come on the show, and then a week before he was supposed to come on, I couldn't get any more responses from him via email. But I was in email contact with him for some time preparing for the show.
So there's two Constantines from the 1800s that play into this. One is Constantine Tischendorf. Constantine Tischendorf goes to St. Catherine's Monastery in Palestine, which is, that monastery has literally been there since almost the beginning of Christianity. And he finds a document called the Codex Sinaiticus, which for some reason, he's the only one to ever seen ever. These monks have been there for literally thousands of years, and they've never seen this Codex Sinaiticus, which everyone, they're skeptical of it originally. But as it starts gaining steam, people start asking, well, where did this document come from? Well, there's another Constantine, and his name is Constantine Simonides, who was easily the most prolific archaeological fraudster of the 1800s. He claims to have fabricated the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, the Codex Sinaiticus, and I've got books coming on this, so this is just speculation. The Codex Sinaiticus is important in modern scholarship, and this will tie us back into Vatican II, in that it leaves out the concluding chapters of St. Mark. So up until the Codex Sinaiticus, everybody was convinced that Matthew was the oldest gospel in the Bible. The Codex Sinaiticus is considered older because it leaves the resurrection of Christ out. So it's important whether it was a fraud or not.
Right.
No, and so what happens is nobody accepts it really as definitive until somewhere around Vatican II, where all of the Bible translations, now if you look and have either parentheses or something at the end of Mark saying this was not an authentic thing, it was something that was tacked on at a much later date, as proof by the Codex Sinaiticus.
Right.
So that's the story. Now, whether you buy into it, I'm very skeptical that the Codex Sinaiticus is a real text, but
right. Well, there's always an effort to undermine Logos,
Yeah.
And so, why wouldn't they fake the Dead Sea Scrolls? Why wouldn't they fake Codex Sinaiticus? On and on and on,
Well, and as we've talked, you don't have to fake the whole thing.
No, but you have to fake enough of it. You take
Right.
from the Cairo-Geniza scrolls and other stuff, and you do a patchwork, and then you put it out, and then you claim, look, this rewrites history again. And then, as we've seen in the last year and a half, most of the sheep will follow along with whatever they're told without, investigating it and thinking it through for themselves.
Well, and as we've talked about before, and probably worth bringing up again, is we always talk about the Calhoun rats, where researcher John Calhoun took rats and put them in a chamber where he kept increasing the population to see what happened. And as you can imagine, these rats, that eventually they reach a tipping point where their society falls apart through the anxiety.
Right, and the behavioral...
Anxiety is a big motivator on that. You can see a similarity what the Manichaeans were doing, where you push society through an obsession, say, of not just killing, but environmental cleanliness or something. You push it to a degree that's unsolvable. You create a societal angst, or under that societal angst is where these people are the most, they're weakest against propaganda. You can do what you want with them. So it's interesting, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, almost to a man, all the original scholars said, literally called the Dead Sea Scrolls a hoax.
Right. Well, and you had sent me a quote about the Dead Sea Scrolls being a fake from one of the first Israeli scholars on it, and I'm just trying to find it here.
It's Solomon Zeitlin.
Yeah. So.
And Solomon Zeitlin is
he said, although I have already written on this matter, I believe that in order to grasp the entire hoax And to steer clear of the sensational publicity, I should restate some of the facts, and that's from Solomon Zeitlin, Jewish Quarterly Review, July 1950.
Right. And he's no pushover. He is considered the top expert in second temple Judaism. He is the top expert, and he declares them a hoax. And there's actually records, I don't know if I've included in the book, of them going around listening to the advocates of the Dead Sea Scrolls and laughing about them. They couldn't believe anybody could be that stupid to accept them.
Well, and you and I had basically come to the agreement that Allegro believed that the whole thing was legit, and Allegro was poking around and asking the most questions, and he does this whole archaeological search all over the deserts of Palestine and Israel and whatnot at the time, and he doesn't find a dang thing. So that's even more evidence that they were faked.
Well, yeah. And the evidence, I guess what I'm saying is being, that the problems we have with dating these things, that you can find paper to write them on, and you can't date the ink. It's impossible to date the ink. It's not that difficult to fake some of these things.
Right.
Now, but the thing is, I'm not a researcher in that sense. I can't authenticate any or de-authenticate anything. But the coincidences that surround this event, going all the way back to the beginning of the 1800s, it seems to me it falls directly into the designs of what the Catholic Church even called the modernists. That the idea that you could create a religion. One of the theories you had, and I actually confirmed it last night, I was trying to prepare for this, is I found a book written in the 1800s called The Gnostics and Their Remains. And so we had speculated before that the Freemasons had actually derived their things from, I forget his name, but the old man of the mountain, the assassins.
Hassani Sabah.
Yeah. And the book actually has a lot of evidence that is precisely what's true. A lot of the Freemasonic rituals and stuff.
I don't like being right about that, because that's where we get the assassins and this whole line of Aleister Crowley and Timothy Leary and all of these guys that, I exposed in MK Ultra. They were huge fans of this. So it's a continuation of that same thing. We're seeing the same scenario from another angle.
Yeah, and this book was from the 1800s and by a guy named C.W. King, I think it was. He specifically shows that the orders of degrees in Freemasons came directly from the assassins, and he has more proof than just that. The primary thing is that somehow all religions, the basic Sufic principle is the idea that all religions are only shadow of the real religion, which basically is that there's only one religion underneath. And that's this kind of affinity with God type religion, that we're all brotherhoods. Everything's part of this massive brotherhood. And everything
right.
had...
Well, and it fits on a bumper sticker that says, these coexist bumper stickers that you see all over the place. And that's
that's a Sufic idea.
Right. And never mind that these beliefs are totally juxtaposed. Never mind that, for instance, as I just exposed with Lloyd de Jong, that anybody who doesn't agree with Islam, for instance, is a kafir and has to be subjugated, or you pay the jizya tax, which means the capitation tax, and if you don't pay the capitation tax, you're decapitated.
All right. Well, and the thing is, I'm going to go back to this little pamphlet again.
Yep.
They precisely say in the pamphlet what they're about to do, that they want to reduce Christianity to a religion just based on pure love, 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 love. And this that we should all be living in this world of just love, and we can do away with logos. We can do away with anything else. The thing that convinces me is not so much that at this point that I can find a direct line of genesis of this, but all the details and all the massive amount of coincidences that you start finding in all this, going from Oscar Wilde to bestsellers to Look in Life magazine, who literally say during the 1950s and 1960s, they're publishing this stuff for, consumption. It's surprising to me that nobody looked skeptical at any of this. It's right in Life magazine. It's right in Look magazine. And they're bearing their cards at the time, but it was just accepted as that. Well, if that's the way it is, that's the way it is.
So, and we're getting close here to Vatican II. But before we do, what I want to bring up, and I've met Professor Robert Eisenman a couple of times, but without him, the Huntington Library out in Huntington, California, which is basically Pasadena, California, without him, the Dead Sea Scrolls never would have been released, and he's considered one of the Dead Sea Scrolls experts on this stuff. And interestingly, Robert Eisenman, and he's a professor down at University of Long Beach, or Cal State Long Beach. Cal State University Long Beach. But here is this guy that he was at the Beat Hotel with Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and Peter Orlovsky and Gregory Corso and Brian Geisen and all of these guys that later ended up being part of MK Ultra.
Right.
And, so I came across a book of Eisenman's and his poetry, and in the beginning of the book, he's talking about his time at the Beat Hotel, and that was a big, what the heck. But what's interesting about this is Robert Eisenman does some carbon dating on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and are you ready for this, audience? With none other than my former co-host. And so we see that right here. And so suddenly, somehow, redating the radiocarbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And here's my former co-host. And then to give street cred, Eisenman puts his name on this document. Now, and of course, my former co-host had written the Caesar's Messiah thing that we since have realized is nonsense. But, it's a neat package of, I don't know if you could call it neat. It's a dirty package of bullshit,
Well, if you're going to falsify something, me and you or somebody else, we can have philosophical debates till the sky falls. But what better way is just interject fake archaeological evidence?
Right.
And the average person can wrap their mind around that, say, well, if it's fake, it's fake.
Right. But they got to, they've got to continue this on because of Vatican II. So let's go there.
Right. Well, what they're doing is at Vatican II, and I really think Vatican II doesn't start when they say it starts. It really starts going all the way back with this Father Lagrange, where he's the original modernist. There's modernism going on in the guise of Voltaire and different people. What surprised me is when you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, all these people, aside from Allegro, seem to have French connections, French modernist connections.
And Allegro was, I think, the only one that wasn't French, and he was, of course, British out of the University of Manchester.
All right, and he's got problems with it all.
And he's constantly butting heads with the entire rest of the crew until they eventually kick him off and replace him with John. I forget John. What's his name? But so, and Allegro was working on his. He was
the guy that went nuts.
What was his name?
I can't think of it right now.
John, I think it starts with a G or something like that. Now I'm going to have to go back and, it's driving me crazy now. I hate it when I can't think of a name.
That's the hardest part about this for me, is remembering all the names.
Yeah. So here's Allegro, and he's one of the original 8 scholars on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then they replace him with John something or other. I can't think of it. and I'm not seeing it here in the database, so we'll drop it and move on.
But you go back to the 1800s. That's what shocked me even last night. We decided we're going to do this. So I tried to do a little background research. This book of Gnostics and their remains basically is in the middle 1800s is already talking about this Suffolk principle. Well, if you kind of strip this all away from all the archaeological or not archaeological evidence, what they're really, Vatican II is really kind of resurrection. What he's talking about in all this stuff was what's unique to this type of Gnosticism is the idea you had Gnostics, you had maybe early Egyptians and stuff like that were worshiping stars and moons and different things, but the idea that a Gnostic truth was somehow redemptive was something that's clearly of the 18 or 1900. It's not part of the original Gnostic thing. It's the original Gnostics were, and then there's a date on Gnosticism too, and we know the date. The date on Gnosticism about 180 AD. So why are they going back these texts that are supposed to be 180 BC, even though we have a real date? But in the 1800s, he's talking about even before Vatican II, even before that what they're trying to do is to get this Suffolk principle that Freemasonry is kind of built around and has adopted, that there's this one world brotherhood. And that's the only purpose of religion, and that there's something redemptive about having this world brotherhood. So you take original Christianity, the redemptive feature was Christ himself. Now they're replacing that with the idea that this love, this world brotherhood somehow is going to redeem you by joining it.
Well, and so they do this with the Vatican II and with the rewriting of Christianity and taking it from a logos-based religion into this love sort of communist thing, and they do that just in time for the 60s psychedelic summer of love revolution. So they basically start, they repackage it and put it back out there, and then suddenly everybody thinks that Christianity is not about logos or truth is God, but about peace, love, and microdot,
Well, and plus they're also invoking critical theory. I'm trying to be careful here. Critical theory as a way, we kind of date that as if it's a modern thing, but the fact of the matter is critical theory was basically psychological warfare that the Jews developed before and during World War II to fight back against the Nazis who were exterminating their race. So somehow during and after World War II, they take this critical theory and they weaponize it and direct it as a tool of Marxism, and which is not really what it was originally invented, developed for. It was basically a way of using psychology to protect the Jews in Germany. But it comes over here as part of the Frankfurt School, and the Frankfurt School develops it and it becomes wedded to the educational system. Now it becomes a bit as if it was something that just was developed yesterday. It wasn't.
Right. So, all right. So, what was the impact on the Vatican with all of these discoveries? I mean, we've just discussed some of it, but what really happened to, and not just the Vatican, it happened across the board to Protestant Christianity as well.
Yeah, the way where Rome goes, everyone eventually follows, at least in mainstream Christianity. What's surprising to me is I probably have done more research than most people on Vatican II. None out of all the people that are actually even criticizing Vatican II, none of them have landed on, to my knowledge, of what the real problem was. So most people of Vatican II, even the conservatives, said, well, Vatican II was well-intentioned, it just ended up wrong, and we ended up with the wrong architecture, and we ended up with the wrong music, but if we just twist this and fix that, we'll be back again. That's not the case, because the real problem was that we've interjected this Suffolk principle into religion nowadays, and I would say even into modern politics, that somehow the idea of having a redemptive world brotherhood is somehow going to save the world or save you or something.
Well, do you remember in my series with Lloyd, we had even discovered and exposed in that series that the Sufis were behind all of this. And I remember I was driving up to Tahoe with my son, and I'm having this long phone call with Lloyd, and I'm like, I think there's something big to this Sufi thing here. And then here we are a couple years later, still looking at the Sufis as possibly being the top of the tip of the iceberg with this stuff.
And I wouldn't have admitted that before last night, but this book
Really?
was that. I mean, I knew there was connections there, but I'm always kind of holding out for something solid.
Yeah.
And the book I found last night I consider pretty
Well,
solid.
so what we had discussed in the series with Lloyd was that, and so generally we think of Sophism coming from Sophia and, whatnot, but, Sufism. So these are essentially the group of the sophists, and they're going to have all of these pawns in these different groups doing their deeds in front of them, and then meanwhile they stay behind the scenes as this peaceful group, and nobody even looks at them as the perpetrator really behind it all.
Yeah. Oh, and I've still got books coming, so we can have revisit this at a future time when I get more solid on some of this stuff. But the idea is going all the way back to Voltaire and all these, the idea that, and I think there's some good parts of the idea of freedom and liberty and all that stuff that was pushed by the French government, but there's also this side that goes from just being a fairness in politics to being some sort of redemptive thing somehow, where it basically jumps the shark into something, a form of mysticism.
Yeah.
One of the things this book maintained was that, and different ones I've been finding a little bit of evidence for, is that the Freemasons really were robbing Manichaeanism of all their symbolism and all their different things. But really what was under them was not so much of a conspiracy to overturn everything, but it was a method whereby the nobility and the monarchies and the sovereignties of Europe could really kind of manipulate the masses. And I think that to this day, that's, one of the big problems I think in anything that we're having right now is in time periods past, we didn't know when people were lying to us. We had to do a lot of research and luckily get enough books and stuff, but almost anybody can research just about anything these days. The problem isn't so much, it's almost too much data to trying to discern which is the real stuff and the fake stuff.
Right, and many people still don't grasp that a contradiction is always a liar and error, and that's where you need to dig. And right. I still hear people say, "Oh, well, we'll just have to. It's a matter of differing opinion here," and it's like, well, no, it's not. I've done all of this research that you refuse to read, and until you read it, your opinion doesn't mean a damn. Just because you believe something that you've never researched. And people now think that their emotions and their unresearched opinions are just as valid as somebody who's got all of the primary documentation there to present on a subject, And
I know this is a principle of you, but it's a principle of me, is when you want to learn about something, when you want to learn really what was behind something, the doorway is the contradiction.
Absolutely. Every single time. Every time.
Anything you want to really understand, don't believe all the hype. Go through the contradiction and try to resolve it.
I don't know how many times I've said on this show, and I appreciate you calling it a doorway, but it must be hundreds, thousands of times that I've said, whenever you see a contradiction, that's where you dig further down in. Exactly. Until there are no more contradictions. You're left with the truth, and you have that aha epiphany moment. I've got it.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm not at yet with all this Dead Sea stuff. I mean, I was at it when I wrote the book, and the book is complete in that sense. And I had that aha moment, but it left too many things trailing that I cannot reconcile all these contradictions. But at some point, as we've talked about tonight, the depth and breadth of the contradictions all seem to be lining up towards some sort of conclusion like we've been having, that this is an orchestrated thing. It was purposely designed to renovate Christianity into some just a piece of this world religion. Even in talking about logos, one of the biggest things I would say problems is that originally you had this thing called the Nicene Creed, which used the word substance. That the term substance and essence in the creed literally were logos terms. But by the time you get into the 1970s and 80s, most of the mainline churches, the churches that do use the Nicene Creed, have replaced the word substance and essence with one in being.
Yeah.
Well, that's a Suffolk principle.
Orfeo in the chat says, non-contradiction leads only to God.
That's very insightful.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, and then it's, you realize that logic is the art of non-contradiction. Logic brings you to reason, what's reason? Logos. What's logos? Right. Truth. What's logos? God. So, yeah, it's very insightful. Yeah. So thanks for that, Orfeo Treshula. That's his nom de plume.
So hopefully we've got enough stuff I've thrown out there that maybe other people would be sort of curious and engage the battle a little bit and see where it ends up.
Yeah, well, and just start digging around into the contradictions out there. But, and it's like here, 10 years ago, I kind of considered myself a Dead Sea Scrolls expert. I'm still, for disclosure, the publisher of John Allegro. And even though I've stepped away from, believing in his conclusions with that, and you and I had even had a conversation some months back about how, he ended up taking such a nosedive in, in his life and stuff because of what he believed was discovered in these Dead Sea Scrolls. And initially, he was a Methodist minister and a chaplain on a ship for the British Royal Navy. So,
well, but to his credit, though, he was honest enough to unplug at that point. The problem you have in churches these days, even there was a definite, I would say the biggest change in the church, especially being connected to the seminary at the time, was 9/11. There was a healthy skepticism of all this stuff up until 9/11, at least by some people. But once 9/11 hit, it just became perfunctory. Nobody questioned anything anymore. They were just all holy. If you were applying for orders, it was you were just holy, and everybody thought of you as holy. Before then, there was people that would question these things and say there was something went on in the 1960s that screwed this whole thing all up. And it'd be nice to invigorate or reinvigorate that healthy skepticism, that because you're not going to get to true Christianity in the path most are taking right now.
Correct. I 100% agree with that, and that's the purpose of that, and that's why there's over 43,000 different churches today.
Wow.
Which is absurd.
Well, that should be evidence in itself. Look at the scattering that happened after the 1960s.
Yeah.
Yeah, even I have an Orthodox monk who's a friend of mine, and he said, I don't care where you went to church in the 1940s, 1950s. They maybe weren't purely Catholic or purely this, but they all believed in essentially the same thing. Their expression may be been a little bit different. But once you get to Vatican II, the idea, for another term in the Nicene Creed and other things, was the idea of universal. So universal at one time was the very word Catholic. And the very word Catholic is a contraction of Greek words, I think get this right, katho ekumenikos, which literally means one truth for everybody.
Yeah. Well,
okay. Now they changed the meaning of universal. Now universal is we're all part of one big club.
Yeah. Well, and there is only one truth when you get it, and so that's why they've promoted all of the quantum physics and yada 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 that I've exposed for a decade now, literally, and to make people think that there's multiple realities. You can't know the truth. Everything is primacy of consciousness, and truth is arbitrary, and yada yada. So people are just lost, and
Well,
now,
I would say modern physics is literally paradox as truth.
yeah, well said. I'd agree with that. Yeah. I interviewed back in 2011 David Harriman, who wrote the Philosophic Corruption of Physics, and he just goes through and exposes all of the, basically what they do is they build quantum physics on quicksand and then keep going. You start with a false premise and you keep building on top of it, and nobody questions these false premises that are one after the other. And I got a lot of flack for daring to suggest that quantum physics may be a big pile of crap, right?
No.
But when you realize that that non-contradiction leads only to God, and logic, this is why they took logic out of schools, in my opinion, because logic leads you to truth, which leads you to God. And so it all leads that direction. So now, emotions are just as valid as facts and provable truth now, right? So what, if we're led through emotion, what is the end result of that stuff? It can only be down. And it's like, so you and I have both done interviews with Kieran recently, and she took a little clip out of my interview with her last week. If there is no reality, there is no God. If there is no God, there is no truth. If nothing is true, everything is permitted.
Yep.
So where are we now? and pretty soon it's going to be, you can only see like Sodom and Gomorrah type stuff on the horizon, right? And much worse than that.
I've got a secret thing that I haven't really expressed too much, that I think sort of answers it all. Back in the early scholastics, they had a thing called Occam's razor.
Yep.
Which everybody gets wrong. As they say, simpler is better. But Occam's razor really says you can't simplify things past necessity. That there's a bottom limit to how far you can simplify things. But then you end up with a Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and later on you get Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which kind of is heavy in all this stuff. But my theory is that all these things are just more exotic versions of a simple concept. And the simple concept is, and I think the Jews got it right off on the right bat, is that if you dig too far, you just end up, there's a reason why in ancient Judaism the name of God was unspeakable. And I think that as you get too close, the human mind just can't comprehend it. And I think where we dig down, we end up in these paradoxical things. We're reaching a level of incomprehension. It doesn't mean that paradox actually is truth or anything. It just means we've dug too deep. It's that you'll never know that.
And instead of like Nietzsche getting syphilis and going crazy, you just step back and relax and let it go and enjoy the ride, I guess, at that point, right?
Yeah. We'll leave it for another time. Maybe some other time they'll have more information. But no matter where you go and how deep you go, one of the principles of logos and scholasticism was underneath all of this is what they called prime matter. And the very definition of prime matter is incomprehensible matter. Leave it at that, I guess.
All right. Well, so this is my first show in 10 months and a week. I've got to move next week in about 10 days. I'll figure out if I'm going to do a show next Tuesday or not. We'll see. I've enjoyed taking a break for a while, but, it was time to get back to it. So this may be the last time with this lovely scenery behind us, but so we'll figure something out and see what we're going to do in the meantime. But it's good talking to you as always, Steve. You're always insightful and always have, great information to share. And
our points are converging.
They certainly are. Isn't that interesting? Whoever would have thought that the Dead Sea Scrolls and Christianity and MK Ultra would all come together?
And the names are there. I mean, you can't.
Yeah, for sure. Can't deny it. And thanks to those who donated to the show tonight. Lee McCamey gave two donations. Thank you. And Lex Van Man, I greatly appreciate it. And the links for supporting the show are down in the show notes. And you can also send Cash App, $ Logos Media, or, go to Patreon/logosmedia.com, support the show. Steve, where can they get your books? Most of the links are in there in the show notes from last year. I don't know if you've changed them again or anything, but
I haven't changed anything, but you can still email me. It's everybody's kind of dried up in this last year, but I'm still here. I'm more than willing to share. And I got to congratulate, welcome back again, because I know you've been sorely missed by a lot of people.
Well, it was just 12 years of it, and when YouTube pulled the plug on the channel the day after my 12th anniversary show, it was just like need a break from this. 12 years, I needed a break. So
I think there's a lot of work to be done here yet, and one of my fears is that in modern politics, all these things will get resolved, and then we'll quit digging deeper. I guess somewhere all the present day stuff, we're going to get beyond it at some point in time. Things are going to come together, but even that's a bit of an illusion. We still need to right a lot of wrongs.
Yeah, I have to keep this muted. My new next door neighbor across the way here has a Hellcat, and they just fired that up, a Dodge Hellcat. So every time they start the engine, the whole neighborhood shakes and rattles along with it. So, but is that a good place to wrap it up?
I think that's a great place to wrap it up.
All right. Well, until next time, Steve, and thanks all for your support and love and welcomes back and all of that. I greatly appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. And no, I didn't get taken out. No, I didn't get murdered or anything like that. And I do appreciate all of the emails from people over the last 10 months checking in on me and the phone calls and stuff like that. So thank you and much appreciated and much love, everybody. And until next time.